My parents threw me out into the freezing snow on Thanksgiving morning. My brother grinned as he tossed my luggage onto the icy driveway, telling me to enjoy figuring life out. I went straight to the local credit union with the last document my grandmother had given me. The branch manager looked at my file, turned completely pale, and quietly locked the office door. "Madam," he said, his voice shaking, "you really need to sit down. I am Sydney, 33 years old, and my family always treated me like the hired help. Before I share exactly how that locked door changed my entire life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against a toxic family who took you for granted." It was 8 in the morning, and the smell of roasting turkey was already filling the massive kitchen of my parents' suburban Connecticut estate. I was basting the bird, my hands covered in butter and sage, having been awake since dawn to prepare the holiday meal. That was when the heavy oak front door slammed open and a blast of freezing winter air rushed into the house. I turned around to see my sister-in-law, Monique, dragging my heavy winter suitcase across the polished hardwood floors. My brother Brandon was right behind her, carrying 2 more of my bags. Without a single word of explanation, Monique heaved my suitcase straight out the open front door. It tumbled down the icy stone steps and landed with a dull thud in a snowbank. "What are you doing?" I demanded, dropping the basting brush onto the counter. My mother, Patricia, strolled into the kitchen, her silk morning robe perfectly tied, holding a fresh cup of coffee. She did not even flinch at the cold air pouring into the foyer. She calmly walked over to the marble island and slapped a piece of paper down on the counter. It was a formal 30-day eviction notice. "You are leaving," Patricia stated, taking a delicate sip of her coffee. "Right now. Grab your coat." I stared at the piece of paper, my mind racing to comprehend the sheer audacity of the moment. I have paid $2,500 a month in rent for 5 years to live in the carriage house out back. I shot back, my voice rising. "You let Brandon and Monique live in the main house completely rent-free, and you are throwing me out into the snow on Thanksgiving morning." Patricia sneered, looking me up and down as if I were a stranger tracking mud onto her pristine floors. "That was not rent, Sydney. That was a boarding fee. And let us be honest, you are just a glorified landscaper. Brandon is a tech entrepreneur. He is closing a $1 million seed round next week for his new application. He and Monique need the carriage house to set up his executive home office. They cannot be expected to host wealthy investors in a guest bedroom." My father Richard walked in, buttoning the cuffs of his expensive dress shirt. He barely glanced at the eviction notice on the counter. "Listen to your mother, Sydney. You have overstayed your welcome. Your brother is on the verge of making real money. We need the space cleared out today so the interior decorators can come in tomorrow morning." "I am a high-end botanical designer," I argued, fighting the intense tremor of betrayal in my chest. "I design greenhouse ecosystems for wealthy clients. I pay my own bills. Brandon has not worked a real job in 4 years. He is living off your credit cards while pretending to be a startup genius." "Do not you dare speak about my husband that way," Monique snapped, marching back into the kitchen. Her beautiful dark skin glowed against the stark white cabinets, but her expression was twisted with absolute hostility. She crossed her arms, her diamond rings catching the overhead lights. She had always loved asserting her dominance in the family hierarchy, playing the role of the perfect wealthy wife while treating me like the hired help. "Your ugly truck loaded with dirt and fertilizer is an eyesore for the entire neighborhood. Leave the carriage house keys on the counter and get off the property." My father stepped forward, pointing a harsh finger right at my face. "Get out before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." The sheer cruelty of it took my breath away. For years I had maintained the property, paid exorbitant rent for a converted garage, and quietly built my business while they worshipped Brandon. He was the golden child who could do no wrong despite failing at 3 different startups and draining my parents' savings. Now, because he wanted an aesthetic office space to impress fake investors, I was being discarded like trash on a family holiday. Monique picked up my winter boots from the entryway mat and tossed them out the door onto the icy driveway. "Have fun figuring life out." Brandon grinned, leaning against the doorframe. "Try not to freeze out there. They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg to plead for a few more days or to break down and apologize for being an inconvenience. My mother watched me closely, a smug look of satisfaction resting on her face as she waited for my inevitable surrender. Instead, I calmly wiped the butter off my hands using a dish towel. I did not shed a single tear. I walked over to my purse resting on the dining chair and reached inside the inner zippered pocket. My fingers brushed against thick parchment paper. It was a heavy envelope sealed with dark red wax bearing the crest of my late grandmother Josephine. Grandma Josephine had been a self-made force of nature, a woman who built a real estate empire from nothing and saw right through my father's shallow obsession with status. A month before she passed away, she had pressed this exact envelope into my hands. "Only open this if your father crosses the absolute point of no return," she had whispered to me. "When he shows you exactly who he is, take this to Mr. Thorne at the credit union downtown." I pulled the envelope out and held it tightly. I looked around the massive kitchen at my father's arrogant glare, my mother's cold smirk, my brother's lazy grin, and Monique's hostile posture. They had definitely crossed the point of no return. "Keep the turkey?" I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I grabbed my car keys off the counter and walked straight out the front door into the freezing wind. I did not look back as I trudged through the snow to pick up my boots and my suitcase. I threw my luggage into the back of my truck, started the engine, and drove out of the wrought iron gates of the estate. I did not go to a hotel. I did not pull over to cry. I drove straight to the main branch of the credit union in the city center. It was Thanksgiving morning, but I knew Mr. Thorne, the senior branch manager and my grandmother's oldest financial confidant, was known to work in his office on holidays to catch up on end-of-year accounting. I parked my truck, marched up to the glass doors, and knocked firmly until the security guard let me in. I walked straight past the empty teller stations and headed for Mr. Thorne's office. It was time to find out exactly what my grandmother had left behind and what kind of storm was about to hit my family. The tires of my truck skidded slightly on the icy asphalt as I pulled into the parking lot of the downtown credit union. The heater was blasting from the dashboard, but I still felt the chill of Thanksgiving morning deep in my bones. I gripped the steering wheel for a long second, taking a deep, steadying breath. I was not going to let my family destroy me. I grabbed the heavy envelope with my grandmother's red wax seal from the passenger seat and marched straight through the sliding glass doors of the bank. The credit union was quiet, operating on a skeleton crew for the holiday morning. I bypassed the empty main teller line and walked directly toward the frosted glass office of Mr. Thorne. He was the senior branch manager, a meticulous man in his late 60s who had managed my grandmother Josephine's finances for decades. He looked up from his computer monitor as I pushed the door open, his brow furrowing in confusion at my sudden and unannounced appearance. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I dropped the heavy envelope right in the center of his immaculate mahogany desk. My father just handed me a 30-day eviction notice and physically threw my luggage into the snow. I stated, my voice completely steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "Grandma Josephine told me to bring this to you the second he crossed the line." Mr. Thorne stared at the dark red wax seal. He recognized the family crest pressed into it immediately. He reached out, broke the brittle wax, and pulled out a single sheet of heavy parchment. I watched his eyes scan the handwritten text. He read it once. Then he read it a second time. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking ashen and breathless. He stood up so quickly his heavy leather chair slammed against the wall behind him. Without saying a single word, he walked over to the office windows and pulled the blinds shut tight. Then he stepped to the heavy glass door, clicked the deadbolt into place, and turned back to face me. "Madam," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, serious whisper, "you really need to sit down." I lowered myself into the chair opposite his desk, my pulse pounding loudly in my ears. "What does it say?" I asked, leaning forward. "Does she have a secret fund to help me move out?" Mr. Thorne let out a heavy breath that sounded almost like a humorless laugh. "Sydney, your grandmother was a brilliant woman, and she knew exactly how greedy and financially reckless your father was. She knew he would eventually try to sacrifice you to fund your brother's constant failures. You do not need a moving fund because you do not need to move. You own the estate. I stared at him, absolutely sure I had misheard him. I do not own the estate, I argued, shaking my head. My parents inherited the $4 million property when she died 5 years ago. I am just their tenant. I pay them rent for the carriage house in the back. Mr. Thorne shook his head firmly, placing his hands flat on the desk. They never inherited the estate. Josephine placed the entire property into a blind trust, with you named as the sole exclusive beneficiary. Your parents were only granted a conditional life estate. That meant they were legally allowed to live in the main house for the rest of their lives, provided they followed two very strict legal conditions. Condition 1, they could never charge you a single dime to live on your own property. Condition 2, they could never attempt to evict you or deny you access. By handing you that formal eviction notice this morning, your father legally terminated his own right to live on the property. The room started to spin. The sheer magnitude of the deception was staggering to comprehend. My parents had treated me like a nuisance, a squatter on their land while secretly living in a house that belonged entirely to me. But the rent, I protested, gripping the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles turned white. I have wired $2,500 every single month to the estate management account. They demanded it. They said I had to pay market rate or they would throw me out on the street. Mr. Thorne turned his computer monitor around to face me. He clicked a few buttons and pulled up a banking ledger. They never touched that money, Sydney, because they legally could not access it. The routing number they gave you for the estate management account was actually a high-yield investment portfolio that Josephine set up solely in your name. Every time you made a rent payment, the bank automatically invested it for you. She designed it as a trap. If Richard ever tried to extort you, the money would simply build a safety net for your future. I looked at the bold green numbers resting at the bottom of the screen. I had over $175,000 in liquid cash compounding interest every single day. I was not a broke landscaper starting over from scratch. I was a millionaire with a massive financial safety net. A fierce, burning sense of vindication flared up in my chest. My parents thought they were bankrupting me, but they had just been forcing me to save my own money. I am going back right now, I said, grabbing my purse from the floor. I am going to show them this paperwork and kick them out before they can even serve the Thanksgiving turkey. Sit down, Sydney. Mr. Thorne commanded, his tone suddenly incredibly sharp and urgent. The rush of vindication vanished the second I looked at his face. He was not smiling. In fact, he looked absolutely terrified. He unlocked his bottom desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder marked with urgent red tape. He slid it slowly across the polished desk toward me. The eviction notice is just the trigger that allows us to act, he explained grimly. But it is not the worst thing your parents did this week. I opened the heavy folder. Inside was a massive stack of bank documents. 48 hours ago, your father and mother applied for a $500,000 home equity line of credit against the estate, Mr. Thorne said, watching my face closely. They told the loan officer they needed the $500,000 in cash to fund Brandon's new tech startup. But because the property is locked in a blind trust, the bank underwriting department flagged the application. They told your parents the loan could not be approved unless the primary trust beneficiary signed as the guarantor. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I never signed any loan documents, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I would never give Brandon a single dime, let alone risk my home for his fake company. Mr. Thorne pointed a shaking finger at the bottom page of the contract. Then look at the signature line. I flipped to the final page of the heavy document. There, perfectly mimicking my handwriting, looping in bold and blue ink, was my name. My parents had not just tried to kick me out of my home. They had committed felony wire fraud, forging my signature to steal $500,000 against a house they did not even own, all to feed the delusions of their golden child. I stared at the blue ink on the final page of the loan application. It was a perfect forgery of my signature. My parents had not just stolen my peace of mind, they were actively trying to steal a $500,000 in my name. Mr. Thorne immediately halted the loan processing and referred me to the most ruthless trust and real estate litigator in the city. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a corner suite of the downtown Marriott. My new attorney Meredith was a shark in a tailored charcoal pantsuit. She had spent the last hour spreading copies of the blind trust, the deed, and the fraudulent loan application across the glass coffee table. Meredith explained the gravity of the situation with chilling precision. My parents had committed felony fraud. They had violated the core terms of the conditional life estate by charging me rent and initiating a hostile eviction. The blind trust my grandmother set up was ironclad. I was the sole legal owner of the $4 million property, and their right to live there was officially terminated the second that eviction notice hit the kitchen counter. Suddenly, my cell phone buzzed against the glass table. Then it vibrated again. A rapid, endless succession of notifications began flooding my screen, lighting up the dim hotel room. I picked up the phone and saw my Facebook application overloaded with tags, mentions, and direct messages. Monique had just posted a video. I tapped the screen and Monique's face appeared. She was standing in the grand dining room of my estate, holding a tissue to her perfectly contoured face. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. Her voice trembled as she looked directly into the camera, squeezing out fake tears for her audience. "My heart is absolutely broken today," Monique sobbed to her followers. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this on Thanksgiving. My toxic sister-in-law, Sydney, just suffered a complete mental breakdown. She ruined our family holiday, screamed at my elderly in-laws, stole cash out of my mother-in-law's purse, and vanished into the snow. We are terrified for her. We just want her to get psychiatric help. Please pray for our family as we try to pick up the pieces." My blood ran cold. The comments section beneath the video was a toxic wasteland of extended family members and family friends tearing my reputation apart. Aunt Carol wrote that I had always been a bitter, jealous girl who could not handle Brandon's success. Cousin David commented that I was probably on drugs and needed an intervention. People I had known my entire life were calling me a disgrace, a thief, and a monster. They were rallying behind Monique, treating her like a saint, while sitting comfortably in the house that I legally owned. This was not a new tactic. Growing up, whenever my parents or Brandon treated me terribly, they would immediately rush to the extended family to spin the narrative, painting me as the unstable, difficult child to mask their own cruelty. Monique had simply weaponized that old family dynamic for the digital age. Meredith watched the video over my shoulder, her expression unreadable. She pulled a notepad from her briefcase. "Defamation and libel," she noted calmly, writing it down. "Add it to the pile." Before I could even process the sheer volume of hateful comments, the video feed cut out, replaced by an incoming call. The caller ID flashed Brandon's name. I looked up at Meredith. She gave me a sharp nod and pointed a pen at the screen. "Answer it," she commanded. I accepted the call, placed the phone on the glass coffee table, and pressed the record button on my tablet app. Brandon's voice boomed through the quiet hotel room. He did not sound heartbroken or terrified for my well-being like his wife had just portrayed to the entire internet. He sounded exactly like a cheap mob boss trying to shake down a vulnerable target. "Listen to me very carefully, you ungrateful brat," Brandon sneered. "Dad is furious. He says if you wire $10,000 right now for breaking your lease on the carriage house, they will not sue you for property damage. Do not think you can just run away from your financial obligations." I leaned back on the hotel sofa, crossing my arms. "Property damage," I repeated, keeping my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. "Do not play dumb," Brandon barked. "You left the carriage house a complete mess. We have to hire an emergency cleaning crew and a contractor to fix the walls before I can move my startup headquarters in there. Wire the 10 grand by tomorrow morning, or we are dragging you to court. Do not test us, Sydney. You are just an overgrown gardener. You do not have the money or the brains to fight a real legal battle." I let his arrogant words hang in the air for a long moment. I looked at Meredith, who was smiling a dangerous, predatory smile. I leaned forward, bringing my face closer to the phone's microphone. "Do you know what the penalty is for felony wire fraud in this state, Brandon?" I asked smoothly. The line went dead silent. "Do you know what the federal penalty is for forging a signature on a $500,000 home equity line of credit application?" I continued, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Because the fraud department at the credit union certainly does." I could hear Brandon's breathing hitch. The arrogant bravado vanished instantly. How he stammered his voice, suddenly sounding very small. "How do you know about the loan?" "Enjoy the turkey, Brandon," I said, ignoring his panic. "Eat every last bite, because it is the last meal you and your fake investors are ever eating in that house." I reached out and ended the call, cutting off whatever frantic excuse he was about to make. I tossed the phone back onto the table and looked across the room at my attorney. Meredith was already pulling a fresh stack of legal documents from her briefcase, her pen hovering over the signature line. "Trigger the eviction," I told her. "Let us take my house back." Exactly 7 days after Thanksgiving, the carriage house glowed with rented string lights and the sheer arrogance of stolen money. I stood at the edge of the driveway, watching valet drivers park a parade of European luxury cars on the pristine gravel I had maintained with my own 2 hands for 5 years. Brandon and Monique were hosting a combined housewarming and startup launch party. Through the massive glass doors of the carriage house, I could see catered waiters in crisp white shirts passing out champagne flutes to a crowd of people dressed in designer evening wear. Brandon was standing by the stone fireplace, wearing a tailored velvet blazer, gesturing wildly as he pitched his vaporware tech application to a group of older, wealthy men. Monique was floating through the crowd in a floor-length sequined gown, playing the role of the devoted executive wife. They had completely rearranged my former living space, filling it with rented modern art and rented leather sofas to project an image of absolute success. They expected me to be hiding in a cheap motel somewhere, crying over the vicious social media smear campaign they had launched against me. They expected the girl in the dirt-stained overalls who always kept her head down and absorbed their abuse. Tonight, I was not that girl. I wore a sharp charcoal gray power suit tailored perfectly to my frame, a pair of black stiletto heels, and I carried a leather briefcase containing documents that would shatter their entire reality. I had absolutely zero tolerance left for their delusions. I walked past the valet stand and stepped through the double doors of the carriage house. The jazz music was loud, but my entrance did not go unnoticed. Monique spotted me first. Her fake polite hostess smile dropped instantly, replaced by a deep scowl of genuine disgust. She marched across the room, her voice rising above the music, intentionally loud enough for the nearest group of potential investors to hear. "Oh, look, everyone," Monique announced, waving her champagne glass in my direction. The homeless landscaper came crawling back. "I guess you saw the catering vans and figured you could score some free food and champagne before you go back to whatever shelter you are sleeping in." A few guests chuckled uncomfortably. Brandon turned around, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He quickly excused himself from the older men he was pitching to and stormed over to us. He grabbed my arm, trying to yank me toward the door, but I stood my ground, immovable as a stone pillar. "Sydney, you have serious nerve showing your face here," he hissed, trying to keep his voice low so his guests would not hear the panic vibrating in his chest. "I told you on the phone that if you did not wire that $10,000, we were taking you to court. Get out of my house right now before I have the security team throw you out. You are ruining my seed round pitch." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I pulled my arm out of his grasp and simply looked at the man standing directly behind Brandon. It was Marcus Vance, a prominent venture capitalist known for his ruthlessness in the boardroom and his immaculate sprawling estates in the Hamptons. He was exactly the kind of whale Brandon was desperately trying to harpoon to fund his fake lifestyle. I stepped neatly around my brother and extended my hand to the older man. "Marcus, it is wonderful to see you outside of the city," I said smoothly. Marcus Vance's stern, evaluating face immediately broke into a wide, genuine smile. He clasped my hand warmly, pulling me in for a brief, friendly hug. "Sydney, what a fantastic surprise. I had no idea you ran in these suburban circles. I thought you would be entirely too busy prepping the botanical designs for my new Hamptons property to attend a local launch party." Brandon stared at us, his jaw practically unhinged. Monique looked like she had just been slapped across the face. Her smug expression melted into absolute confusion. "You two know each other?" Brandon stammered, looking frantically between me and the billionaire investor. Marcus chuckled, patting my shoulder with immense respect. Know each other. Sydney is the chief executive officer of the most exclusive botanical design firm on the East Coast. I just signed a $2 million contract with her firm last week to redesign my entire estate. She is an absolute genius with landscape architecture and ecological design. I trust her judgment implicitly. I turned my attention back to my brother and sister-in-law, letting a slow, razor-sharp smile form on my lips. I am not here for free champagne, Monique. I am here because Marcus asked me to evaluate the soil quality and greenhouse potential of this property before he committed any funds to this supposed startup. I paused, letting the silence spread through the room as the jazz band finished their song. The entire party had gone dead silent. Every single guest was now staring directly at us, hanging on my every word. But honestly, Marcus, I would hold off on writing any checks to my brother. I continued, my voice echoing clearly across the carriage house. What are you talking about? Marcus asked, his warm smile fading into a sharp analytical stare as he looked at Brandon. I looked directly into Brandon's terrified, wide eyes. I am saying his entire life is a facade. He has absolutely no assets, no business plan, and no capital. Oh, and Brandon, the luxury rental agency called my cell phone by mistake this afternoon because my name is still tied to this address. Your leased Porsche parked out in the driveway is due back by 8 o'clock tonight, and your credit card on file just declined the extension fee. The collective gasp from the wealthy crowd echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Investors began whispering to each other, stepping away from Brandon as if he were suddenly contagious. Monique dropped her champagne glass entirely. It shattered against the hardwood floor, the expensive liquid pooling around her designer heels, matching the exact moment their fake empire completely shattered. The sound of shattering glass was the only noise in the carriage house for 5 agonizing seconds. Marcus Vance looked at Brandon with absolute disgust, shook his head, and walked straight out the door. The other investors immediately followed suit, murmuring among themselves, grabbing their coats and fleeing the sinking ship. Brandon looked like he was going to vomit. He stood frozen, staring at the puddle of champagne soaking into the expensive rugs. But my father Richard had a completely different reaction. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He shoved his way through the remaining guests, his expensive loafers stomping across the hardwood. "How dare you humiliate this family!" Richard roared, his voice booming off the exposed brick walls. "You ungrateful, vindictive little wretch! I told you to get off my property this morning." He reached into his tailored slacks, pulled out his phone, and aggressively punched in 3 numbers. I stood my ground, my hands resting lightly on the leather handle of my briefcase. I watched him press the phone to his ear, his chest heaving with manufactured indignation. "Yes, I need police dispatch immediately," Richard barked into the receiver. "I have a hostile trespasser refusing to leave my property. She is harassing my guests and threatening my family. Send officers right now to the Wilson estate." He ended the call and pointed a shaking finger at my face. "You pushed it too far this time, Sydney. I am having you arrested. You are going to spend Thanksgiving weekend in a holding cell, and I will make sure the judge throws the book at you." My mother Patricia instantly snapped into action. Seeing the few remaining guests watching the spectacle, she clamped a hand over her mouth and let out a dramatic, wavering sob. She leaned heavily against a rented leather sofa, playing the fragile, terrified matriarch to absolute perfection. "Why is she doing this to us?" Patricia wailed, dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. "We gave her everything. We gave her a place to live, and she just wants to destroy her brother out of pure jealousy. Please, someone get her away from us." Monique, desperate to recover from her earlier humiliation, quickly rushed to Patricia's side. She grabbed a fresh glass of champagne from a terrified catering waiter who was frozen against the wall, taking a massive gulp to steady her nerves. She wrapped her free arm around my mother, glaring at me with vicious triumph. "You are finished," Sydney Monique sneered. "The police are going to drag you out of here in handcuffs." I did not say a word. I did not need to. I simply walked over to the sleek modern bar Brandon had set up, pulled out a bar stool, and sat down. I placed my leather briefcase on the counter and waited. 10 minutes later, the heavy thud of car doors slamming echoed from the driveway. Red and blue lights flashed intensely through the massive glass windows of the carriage house, painting the snow-covered lawn in harsh, strobe-like colors. 2 police cruisers had pulled right up to the entrance. 3 officers strode through the double doors, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. The lead officer, a tall, imposing sheriff with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression, scanned the room. "Who made the call?" the sheriff demanded, his voice cutting through the tense silence. Richard rushed forward, gesturing wildly toward me. "I did, officer. That woman right there is my daughter, but she has completely lost her mind. She was evicted this morning, and now she is trespassing, harassing my son, and causing a massive disturbance. I want her removed in handcuffs immediately." Patricia let out another loud theatrical sob, burying her face in Monique's shoulder. "She is scaring us," Officer Patricia cried out. "She is completely unstable. We do not feel safe in our own home." The sheriff nodded gravely, taking in the scene. He walked over to where I was sitting at the bar. He looked me up and down, noting my calm demeanor and my tailored suit, which sharply contrasted with the hysterical portrait my parents had just painted. "Miss," the sheriff said, his tone firm but professional, "the property owners have asked you to leave. I need you to stand up, gather your things, and exit the premises immediately. If you refuse, I will have to place you under arrest for criminal trespassing." I looked at the sheriff, maintaining direct eye contact. "I understand you are just doing your job, officer," I replied smoothly. "But there seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding about who actually owns this property." Richard scoffed, loudly crossing his arms. "Do not listen to her delusions. I am Richard Wilson. This is my estate. Arrest her." I unclasped the brass locks on my briefcase. The sharp click echoed loudly in the quiet room. I reached inside and pulled out 2 thick stacks of legal documents printed on heavy stock paper and stamped with the official blue seals of the county clerk and the district court. I slid the first stack across the bar counter toward the sheriff. "That is the certified deed of trust for this entire $4 million estate," I stated clearly, making sure my voice carried to the back of the room. "It legally lists me, Sidney Wilson, as the sole and exclusive owner." The sheriff frowned, picking up the document. His eyes scanned the official county seals and the highlighted beneficiary lines. I slid the second stack of papers forward. "And this," I continued, my voice ringing with absolute authority, "is an emergency notice to vacate signed by a Superior Court judge exactly 2 hours ago. My parents were granted a conditional life estate by my late grandmother, which they completely voided this morning by illegally attempting to evict me and committing felony wire fraud in an attempt to mortgage my property." The sheriff read through the judge's signature, his face hardening as he processed the undeniable legal proof in his hands. The tension in the carriage house was thick enough to choke on. Brandon had backed away until he hit the brick wall. Patricia had stopped her fake crying entirely, her mouth hanging open in silent horror. Richard's arrogant posture evaporated, his arms dropping uselessly to his sides. The sheriff slowly lowered the documents to the counter. He turned his back to me and faced my parents, his expression shifting from professional patience to absolute rigid authority. "Sir," the sheriff said, his voice cold and booming, "this young woman is the legal owner of this entire estate. Your life estate was terminated due to breach of trust. You, your son, and his wife have exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises before I arrest you all for trespassing." Monique's hand began to shake violently. The fresh glass of champagne slipped through her trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor, shattering. The sound of shattering crystal snapped whatever spell had been holding the room together. The remaining investors did not wait for an explanation. They practically trampled each other trying to reach the coat check. Brandon lunged forward, grabbing the arm of a tech executive in a panicked grip, frantically promising that it was all a massive misunderstanding and that the seed round was still open. The executive shook him off with a look of absolute revulsion and hurried out the double doors. Outside, the gravel driveway turned into a chaotic chorus of slamming car doors and roaring engines as the valet drivers scrambled to return the luxury vehicles. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the mass exodus, casting long, erratic shadows across the carriage house walls. The sheriff did not flinch at the ensuing panic. He kept his stern gaze locked squarely on my father. 72 hours, the sheriff repeated, his voice carrying the weight of the law. I highly suggest you start gathering your belongings tonight. If my deputies have to return to this property on Thursday, we will not be knocking politely. My father opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer, overwhelming reality of the certified court documents sitting on the bar counter finally silenced him. He looked at the armed officers, then at the empty room, and finally at me. The absolute hatred in his eyes was palpable, but he had no moves left to play. He grabbed my mother by the arm, roughly pulling her toward the exit. Brandon and Monique followed close behind, their heads bowed as they walked past the police officers and into the freezing November night. The weekend was a blur of frantic, humiliating labor for my family. Under the watchful eye of a private security firm I had hired with my own funds, they were forced to empty the massive estate they had falsely claimed as their own. I watched from the security monitors as Patricia wept genuine tears, aggressively shoving her designer shoes and silk dresses into heavy cardboard boxes. Richard paced the hardwood floors of the master bedroom, aggressively barking orders at Brandon, who was struggling to carry heavy, flat-screen televisions down the grand staircase. On Sunday night, the tension inside the main house reached a boiling point. I was reviewing the security feed from my hotel room when I heard my father speak. He was standing in the foyer, surrounded by a mountain of luggage, pouring himself a generous glass of scotch. Patricia was sitting on a taped-up moving box, her face buried in her hands. "Stop crying, Patricia," Richard snapped, taking a heavy swallow of his drink. "Let Sydney have her little moment of victory with the house. She thinks she has won, but she is completely naive." Patricia looked up, her mascara smeared across her cheeks. "We are being thrown out into the street, Richard. How can you possibly be so calm?" Richard smiled, a cold, calculating grin that made my skin crawl. "Do not worry. The $500,000 HELOC loan clears on Monday morning. The moment that cash hits our joint account, we are untouchable. We will hire the best lawyers in the state, bury her in endless litigation, and destroy her entirely. She will be begging us to take the house back by the time I am done bleeding her dry in court." By Monday morning, the stark reality of their situation had firmly set in. Because Brandon's credit cards were entirely maxed out, and my parents' liquid cash was tied up in bad investments, they were forced to check into a cheap roadside motel on the edge of the city limits. The contrast was staggering. The cramped rooms smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial bleach. The floral bedspreads were worn thin, and the flickering neon sign outside cast a sickly green glow across the stained carpet. Richard sat at the tiny, wobbly laminate desk in the corner of the room, aggressively typing on his laptop. He had his banking portal open, refreshing the page with frantic, heavy clicks of his mouse. He was waiting for the $500,000 loan deposit to appear. He clicked the transfer tab, entered the routing number for an offshore legal retainer account, and hit submit. The screen immediately froze. A bright red warning banner flashed across the monitor. "Access denied. Account frozen." Richard cursed loudly, slamming his fist onto the desk. He grabbed his cell phone and furiously dialed the direct line for the credit union. Mr. Thorne answered on the second ring, his voice completely devoid of his usual polite customer service tone. "Listen to me very carefully, Thorne," Richard barked, ignoring any pleasantries. "There is a glitch in your system. My account is locked and the home equity funds have not been deposited. I need that transfer cleared manually right now." Mr. Thorne let out a heavy, disappointed sigh that carried clearly through the phone's speaker. "There is no glitch, Richard. I personally froze your accounts at dawn." "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded, the color beginning to drain from his face. "You do not have the authority to freeze my money." "I have the authority to halt a fraudulent transaction," Mr. Thorne replied coldly. "Your daughter sat in my office on Thanksgiving morning. We reviewed the loan application together. She confirmed that the signature on the guarantor line was a complete forgery. I have officially reported the fraudulent application to our internal fraud department, and per federal banking regulations, I have notified the authorities. You will not be receiving a single dime." The phone slipped from Richard's sweaty palm, clattering loudly onto the cheap motel desk. He sat frozen, staring blankly at the red error message on his laptop screen as the absolute finality of his ruin washed over him. He was broke, homeless, and facing imminent felony charges. A sharp intake of breath from the doorway shattered the silence. Monique was standing in the threshold of the adjoining motel room, holding a plastic bucket of cheap ice. She had heard every single word echoing from the phone speaker. The heavy layers of denial she had been carrying all weekend instantly evaporated. She dropped the ice bucket. It hit the floor with a dull thud, scattering ice cubes across the stained carpet. She marched down the narrow, dingy motel hallway, her designer heels clicking furiously against the cheap linoleum. She slammed her fists against the door of Brandon's room until he pulled it open, looking disheveled and exhausted. Monique did not hesitate. She shoved her way inside, backing Brandon up against the wall. "What do you mean the money is frozen?" Monique screamed, her voice completely hysterical. "You told me you owned that house. You told me your startup was funded. You promised me we were going to be rich." Brandon held up his hands, his eyes darting nervously down the hallway as other motel guests began opening their doors to watch the spectacle. "Monique, keep your voice down. We are just hitting a temporary cash flow issue. Dad is fixing it." "Fixing it?" Monique shrieked, entirely unhinged. "Your father just committed federal bank fraud. You are a broke, pathetic liar who leeches off his sister. I married a fake millionaire." Patricia rushed out of her room, attempting to silence her daughter-in-law, but Monique turned her vicious anger entirely on her. The toxic enablers had finally run out of victims to target, leaving them no choice but to turn on each other like a pack of starved wolves. I sat in the quiet luxury of my downtown hotel suite, miles away from the cheap roadside motel where my family was currently tearing each other apart. The fallout from the frozen bank account was entirely predictable. Without my father's money to shield them, their toxic loyalty dissolved instantly. My phone vibrated against the glass coffee table, breaking the silence of the room. It was a text message from Richard. I opened it, expecting a pathetic plea for cash, or perhaps another hollow legal threat. Instead, it was a volatile, desperate promise of violence. "If you do not drop this eviction and give us our house back, I will make sure there is no house left for you to take." I stared at the glowing screen. Most people would assume it was an empty threat born of a bruised ego. But I knew my father. I knew the destructive, petulant rage that boiled beneath his tailored suits and country club smile. When Richard Wilson did not get his way, he broke things. He had smashed my award-winning science projects when I was a child just because I interrupted his golf game to show him. He had intentionally backed his luxury sedan over my bicycle when he was angry about a work deal, and he had shattered my mother's heirloom china during arguments just to watch her flinch. He would absolutely destroy that $4 million estate rather than see me rightfully own it. I did not reply. A response was exactly what he wanted. He wanted to know he had struck a nerve. He wanted to feel like he still had some measure of control over my emotions. Instead of typing a response, I made a phone call. By noon on Tuesday, while my family was busy arguing with motel management over declined credit cards, a discreet high-end private security firm arrived at the estate. I paid a premium rush fee for absolute discretion and rapid deployment. Over the next 6 hours, a team of technicians wired the entire property. They installed microscopic high-definition cameras in the ornate crown molding of the main house, tucked them into the vaulted ceilings of the carriage house, and concealed them around the exterior entryways. More importantly, they integrated a state-of-the-art smart home audio system, linking the entire property's intercom directly to an encrypted application on my phone. I specifically instructed the lead technician to focus the primary camera angles on the grand foyer and the main living room. That was where Grandma Josephine's antique stained glass windows were installed. They were massive custom pieces commissioned in the early 1920s, depicting intricate botanical scenes that refracted the morning light into a stunning kaleidoscope of colors. They were priceless. They were completely uninsured because my father had let the policy lapse to cover Brandon's sports car leases, and they were the structural and historical soul of the house. If Richard wanted to inflict maximum emotional and financial damage, he would go straight for the glass. Tuesday night bled into Wednesday morning. I sat in the dark of my hotel room, the cool glow of my tablet illuminating my face. The grid of live camera feeds showed the empty, silent rooms of the estate. My family was supposed to be completely moved out, and the property was legally locked down. But I knew Richard's ego would never allow him to walk away quietly. He needed to leave a scar. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, a sharp digital notification chimed loudly in the silent hotel room. Motion detected at the rear patio entrance. I sat up straight instantly, expanding the camera feed on my tablet screen. The night vision display kicked in, rendering the scene in crisp black and white detail. A figure dressed in a heavy dark coat with a pulled-down baseball cap was prying open the back door. The lock, which he had clearly tampered with before they vacated the premises, gave way with minimal effort. It was Richard. He stepped into the mudroom, his heavy boots leaving tracks of dirt and melting snow on the pristine vintage tiles. He was not carrying a duffel bag to steal leftover valuables. He was gripping a heavy steel sledgehammer in his right hand. The metal head caught the faint light from the window. He walked with heavy, deliberate steps, bypassing the renovated kitchen and heading straight down the hallway toward the main living area. His target was exactly what I had predicted: the stained glass windows. He stopped in the center of the sprawling living room. The moonlight filtered through the antique glass, casting a faint, colorful glow over his face. Even through the security feed, I could see his features twisted into a mask of pure, bitter malice. He adjusted his grip on the sledgehammer, rolling his shoulders back, preparing to swing the heavy steel head directly into the center panel of the century-old glass. He wanted to shatter my grandmother's legacy, to reduce the history of the house to jagged shards on the floor, just to spite me for outsmarting him. My finger hovered over the emergency dial button on the security app, which would instantly connect me to the local police precinct dispatch. A break-in combined with severe property damage would guarantee a felony conviction. The police could be there in minutes. But simply having him arrested in silence felt insufficient. It let him off too easily. I wanted him to know in his very bones that his reign of terror was over. I wanted him to realize that I was watching his every move, anticipating his every failure, and completely controlling the environment he thought he owned. I bypassed the police button and tapped the microphone icon connected to the estate's hidden intercom system. I took a slow, deep breath, staring at his raised sledgehammer on the screen, and let my voice drop to a cold, razor-sharp whisper that would echo through the high-definition speakers hidden in the ceiling above his head. Felony vandalism over $10,000 carries a 5-year minimum sentence, Dad. My voice boomed through the hidden surround sound speakers, echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the main house with crystalline clarity. Add that to the forged home equity line of credit, and you will die in federal prison. Richard froze entirely. The heavy steel sledgehammer slipped from his trembling leather-gloved hands. It hit the hardwood floor with a deafening, sickening thud, narrowly missing his expensive boots. He spun around wildly, his eyes darting toward the ceiling, searching the shadows for the source of my voice. His chest heaved with panicked, shallow breaths as the realization washed over him. He was trapped in a high-definition surveillance grid of his own making. "Who is there?" Richard stammered, stepping away from the antique stained glass panels as if they were suddenly radioactive. "Where are you hiding?" "I am sitting comfortably in my hotel suite," I replied smoothly, watching him sweat on the tablet screen. "Every square inch of that estate is wired, Dad. I watched you pick the lock on the mudroom door. I have the entire sequence recorded and uploaded to a secure cloud server. You really thought I would leave $4 million of real estate unprotected from a man who used to smash my science fair projects just to win an argument?" Outside, the crunch of tires on gravel interrupted the silence. Patricia had grown tired of waiting in the idling rental car. The heavy oak front door swung open, and my mother rushed into the foyer, her designer coat wrapped tightly around her shivering frame. She scurried down the hallway, her heels clicking rapidly, until she found Richard standing frozen in the middle of the living room. "Richard, what is taking so long?" Patricia hissed, her voice vibrating with nervous energy. "Smash the damn windows and let us get out of here before the neighbors wake up." "Look up, Mom," I said through the intercom, turning the volume to maximum. Patricia shrieked, jumping backward into a side table. A decorative vase wobbled dangerously before settling. She clutched Richard's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his heavy winter coat. She stared wide-eyed at the ceiling speakers. "Sydney." Patricia gasped, her voice trembling. "You are watching us." "In ultra-high definition," I confirmed coldly. "And so is the private security firm monitoring the feed. You broke into a secured property with a deadly weapon. You crossed the line from petty entitlement straight into major felonies." Panic immediately hijacked my mother's nervous system. The arrogant, dismissive woman who had belittled my existence for 30 years vanished, replaced by a terrified, desperate, cornered animal. She spotted the main house phone resting on the console table. She lunged for it, ripping the receiver from the base and dialing my cell phone number from memory. My personal phone buzzed on the hotel nightstand. I answered it, putting it on speaker so she could hear herself echoing through the estate. "Sydney, please." Patricia wailed into the receiver, her voice cracking with manufactured hysteria. "You cannot do this to us. We made a mistake. Your father was just angry. He was not really going to break anything. You have to delete that footage. I am your mother. I gave birth to you. How can you possibly be so cold?" I watched her on the security feed. She sank to her knees on the hardwood floor, weeping loudly, playing the ultimate victim card. It was the exact same performance she had given her entire life whenever she was caught in a lie. She expected me to fold. She expected the dutiful daughter to rush in, wipe away her tears, and absorb the collateral damage. "You threw me into the snow on Thanksgiving night, Mom," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "You watched Richard lock the door while I stood freezing on the porch with nothing but the clothes on my back. You laughed with Brandon about how I deserved to be homeless. My warmth ran out a very long time ago. We were just trying to teach you a lesson about respect." Patricia sobbed, clinging to the phone receiver like a life raft. "We are family. Family protects each other. Family does not commit wire fraud using my signature," I shot back. "Family does not steal a $4 million estate to fund a fake tech startup. You are not my family. You are simply the people who happen to share my last name until I finally realized my own worth." Richard grabbed the phone from Patricia, his face purple with absolute terror. "Sydney, listen to me. I will pay you back. I will find the money. Just call off the security company. Do not involve the police. It will ruin my reputation. I will lose my country club membership. I will lose everything." "You already lost everything, Dad," I stated, staring at his desperate face on the monitor. "You lost it the moment you decided your ego was more important than your daughter. And as for the police, I do not need to call them." Through the live audio feed, I heard the distinct, heavy crunch of thick tires tearing up the gravel driveway. The sound was immediately followed by the aggressive, sweeping flash of red and blue emergency lights cutting through the darkness outside. The harsh, strobing colors illuminated the antique stained glass windows, casting a fractured, chaotic rainbow across my parents' terrified faces. The silent alarm was triggered the second you broke the mudroom lock. I told them, watching two marked cruisers pull to a sharp halt in front of the estate. "The police are already pulling into the driveway. Have fun in lockup." I ended the call, cutting the intercom feed, and leaned back in my chair. On the silent video feed, I watched as 4 armed officers kicked the front door wide open, their flashlights sweeping through the dark hallway until they landed squarely on Richard and Patricia. Richard slowly raised his hands above his head, the sledgehammer lying uselessly at his feet. My mother collapsed entirely, burying her face in the expensive rug she would never walk on again. The heavy metallic click of handcuffs echoed sharply through the vaulted ceilings of the carriage house. The lead officer shoved Richard against the antique mahogany console table, reciting his Miranda rights with practiced boredom. Richard stammered, his face pressed uncomfortably into the polished wood, demanding to call the mayor, the police commissioner, or anyone who would listen to his bloated ego. The officers completely ignored him. They marched him out into the freezing night and shoved him into the back of a police cruiser. Patricia trailed behind them, screaming wildly, her expensive silk robe dragging through the slush and mud of the driveway. I watched the entire pathetic display from the high-definition security feed in my hotel room, my face completely impassive as the cruiser sped away. The following 48 hours were a masterclass in financial desperation for my parents. Richard was denied immediate release due to the combination of the forged home equity application and the felony vandalism charge. Patricia was forced to scramble. Brandon and Monique had completely vanished, fleeing to a friend's couch in another state rather than deal with the fallout. Left entirely alone, Patricia had to liquidate their very last untouched retirement accounts. Every single penny they had saved for their golden years was drained to post Richard's exorbitant bail and to hire a defense attorney. They did not hire just any attorney. They scraped together enough cash to retain Marcus Sterling, a notoriously aggressive, sleazy litigator known for dragging families through the mud to secure massive settlements. Richard's fragile pride could not accept defeat. Instead of walking away, he decided to double down. They filed a massive civil suit against me, contesting the validity of the deed and the trust itself. Their primary claim was entirely predictable and incredibly vile. They alleged that Grandma Josephine was suffering from severe dementia in her final years, and that I had maliciously manipulated a senile old woman into disinheriting her only son. 3 weeks later, the smell of stale coffee and cheap leather filled a sterile conference room in downtown Boston. I sat at a long mahogany table wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit. Next to me sat my attorney Meredith, a brilliant, razor-sharp woman who radiated quiet, lethal confidence. Across the table, Richard and Patricia glared at me. Patricia looked haggard, her roots showing her designer clothes hanging loosely on her shrinking frame. Richard was sweating profusely, tapping his pen against the table in a rapid, agitated rhythm. Sterling paced the length of the room, playing to the court reporter in the corner. He immediately launched into a vicious, unprovoked attack on my character. He pulled out my old medical records, highlighting a brief period of depression I had suffered in my early 20s after a bad car accident. He twisted the facts aggressively, painting me as emotionally unstable, financially desperate, and entirely capable of elder abuse. He claimed I was a struggling landscaper who saw an easy target in a fading, confused grandmother. "You isolated Josephine," Sterling barked, leaning over the table and pointing a finger directly at my face. "You took advantage of her declining mental state. You convinced a confused, senile woman to strip her devoted son of his rightful inheritance just so you could play at being wealthy. It is textbook manipulation, and we are going to see you stripped of every asset you stole." Oh, I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at Meredith. She gave me a slow, predatory smile. She calmly reached into her sleek leather briefcase. She did not pull out medical records or character testimonies. She pulled out a thick leather-bound ledger. Its pages were yellowed with age, the cover worn from years of handling. She placed it gently on the center of the table. The heavy thud silenced Sterling mid-sentence. "I believe you are fundamentally misunderstanding the timeline of Josephine's mental acuity," Meredith said, her voice smooth as glass. "This is Josephine's personal diary and meticulous accounting book. It spans the last 15 years of her life. She was a brilliant woman who kept track of every single cent she ever earned." Meredith opened the ledger to a bookmarked page, sliding it across the polished wood directly in front of Sterling and Richard. "If you look at the entries from exactly 10 years ago," Meredith continued, her eyes locking onto my father, "you will see a detailed day-by-day account of how Richard systematically siphoned exactly $200,000 from her business accounts. She documented every forged check, every unauthorized withdrawal, and every lie he told her when she confronted him." The color instantly drained from Sterling's face. His aggressive posture melted into sheer panic as his eyes scanned the undeniable proof written in my grandmother's precise, elegant handwriting. Richard choked on a breath, his hands shaking violently as he stared at the ghosts of his past sins staring right back at him. Patricia let out a strangled gasp, pressing her hands against her mouth, as the carefully constructed lie they had built their lawsuit upon disintegrated in seconds. "That is why she created the blind trust," Meredith stated, her voice ringing with absolute finality. "She was not senile. She was protecting her granddaughter and her life's work from a thief." The heavy polished oak doors of the county civil courthouse swung shut, sealing us inside a room that felt as cold and sterile as a hospital ward. This was the final battleground. The hearing was scheduled to finalize the eviction, clear the title of the historic estate, and officially dissolve the absurd encumbrances my father had attempted to place on the property. I sat beside my attorney Meredith at the plaintiff's table, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight. Across the aisle, Richard and Patricia had orchestrated a dramatic wardrobe change. Gone were the tailored Italian suits, the country club signet rings, and the designer silk blouses. Instead, they had dressed for the roles of destitute, fragile victims. Patricia wore a faded, oversized beige cardigan, her shoulders deliberately hunched, her makeup intentionally sparse to highlight the dark circles under her eyes. Richard wore a rumpled corduroy jacket, clutching a walking cane he had never needed before, his hands resting on the curved wooden handle with a manufactured tremor. They were putting on the performance of a lifetime, playing the desperate elderly parents cast aside by a ruthless, greedy daughter. Sitting in the second row of the gallery, completely undermining their parents' impoverished aesthetic, were Brandon and Monique. Brandon wore a flashy designer watch that caught the overhead fluorescent lights, glaring daggers at the back of my head. Monique sat beside him, scrolling aggressively on her phone, looking intensely inconvenienced by the fact that she had to be awake before noon. When the proceedings began, my parents' attorney, an aggressive, notoriously sleazy litigator named Marcus Sterling, immediately launched into his pity play. He stood before the judge, a stern, sharp-eyed woman named Honorable Davis, and painted a tragic portrait. He claimed my parents were vulnerable and completely broke, having poured their life savings into raising me only to be thrown onto the freezing streets over a simple family misunderstanding. When I was called to the stand, Sterling did not hold back. He paced the floor like a caged predator, aggressively attacking my character. He pulled out my old medical records, twisting a brief period of burnout I had suffered in my early 20s to aggressively paint me as emotionally unstable and financially desperate. "You isolated Josephine," Sterling barked, pointing a thick finger directly at my face while I sat in the witness box. "You took advantage of her declining mental state. You convinced a confused, senile woman to strip her devoted son of his rightful inheritance just so you could play at being a wealthy real estate mogul. You are unstable, you are vindictive, and this entire trust is the result of elder abuse." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at Meredith. She stood up smoothly, adjusting her blazer with a calm, predatory smile. "Your Honor, the defense is attempting to build a narrative of manipulation based on the false premise that Josephine Wilson was suffering from cognitive decline. We would like to introduce Plaintiff's Exhibit A to clear up this fundamental misunderstanding." Meredith walked toward the center table and reached into her sleek leather briefcase. She pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. Its pages were yellowed with age, the cover worn from years of handling. She slid the ledger across the polished wood directly toward Sterling. "This is Josephine's personal diary and meticulous accounting book," Meredith stated, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. "It spans the last 15 years of her life. She was a brilliant woman who kept track of every single cent she ever earned. If you turn to the tabbed pages from exactly 10 years ago, you will see a detailed day-by-day account of how Richard systematically siphoned exactly $200,000 from her business accounts." The color instantly drained from Sterling's face. His aggressive posture melted into sheer panic as his eyes scanned the undeniable proof written in my grandmother's precise, elegant handwriting. She documented every forged check, every unauthorized withdrawal, and every lie he told her when she confronted him. Meredith continued, turning her gaze to my father. "That is why she created the blind trust. She was not senile. She was protecting her granddaughter and her life's work from a thief." Richard choked on a breath, his hands shaking violently this time without faking it. Patricia let out a strangled gasp, pressing her hands against her mouth as the carefully constructed lie they had built their lawsuit upon disintegrated in seconds. But I was not finished. The ledger established the foundation of their deceit, but I wanted the court to see exactly who these people were in the present day. "Your Honor," Meredith continued, never losing her rhythm, "the defense claims my client is callously throwing vulnerable, loving parents into the cold. We request permission to submit 2 digital audio files into evidence to demonstrate the true nature of this familial dynamic. Judge Davis, who was currently glaring at Richard with thinly veiled contempt, nodded her approval. Meredith connected her laptop to the courtroom's audio system. She clicked play on the first file. Brandon's voice filled the courtroom, dripping with arrogant entitlement. The recording of his extortion call was crystal clear. The judge listened intently as my brother demanded $30,000 to quietly vacate the carriage house, threatening to rip the copper wiring from the walls and gut the historic home if I refused to pay his ransom. A heavy, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the gallery. I watched Brandon sink lower into the wooden bench, pulling his expensive jacket tighter around his neck to hide his flushed face. Monique stopped scrolling on her phone, her eyes darting nervously toward the heavy oak exit doors. Then Meredith clicked the second file. It was the security audio from Thanksgiving night. The courtroom echoed with the sound of the freezing wind, followed by Patricia's shrill, mocking laughter. Then came Richard's voice, cruel and commanding. "Let her freeze. She can sleep in the snow for all I care. Lock the door." The sound of the heavy deadbolt clicking shut resonated like a gunshot in the silent courtroom. The contrast was devastating. The people currently hunched over their defense table, pretending to be weak, frightened victims, were exposed as vicious, calculating abusers who had gleefully locked their own daughter out in a blizzard. The silence that followed the recording was suffocating. Sterling stared at the floor, slowly packing his legal pads into his briefcase. He knew it was over. He was actively abandoning a sinking ship. Judge Davis leaned forward over the bench. Her expression had hardened into something resembling carved granite. She looked directly at Richard and Patricia with utter disgust. In my 20 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a display of such malicious entitlement and sheer audacity. Judge Davis stated, her voice slicing through the room with freezing authority. This court has zero tolerance for the weaponization of the judicial system to continue a pattern of familial abuse. She picked up her gavel, gripping it tightly. Not only is the eviction upheld, immediately clearing the title entirely in the plaintiff's name, but I am ordering you to repay the trust, the $30,000 you attempted to extort from your daughter. I will see to it that a lien is placed against any future earnings until that debt is satisfied. Patricia gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. Richard's mouth hung open, his fake tremor completely forgotten. Judge Davis slammed the gavel down with a resounding crack. Furthermore, she continued, her voice rising to drown out Patricia's sudden genuine sobs. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented here today, I am officially referring the forged home equity line of credit documents to the district attorney's office. This is no longer just a civil dispute. Prepare yourselves for criminal prosecution. We are adjourned. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B swung open with a resounding thud, spilling the bitter remnants of my family out into the cavernous marble hallway of the civil courthouse. The air outside the courtroom was thick with the immediate crushing weight of Judge Davis's ruling. I walked out shoulder to shoulder with Meredith, my posture straight, the satisfying click of my heels echoing off the stone walls. I felt lighter than I had in 3 decades. The forged home equity line of credit was with the district attorney. The estate was legally and permanently mine. The extortion debt of $30,000 was officially hung around my parents' necks. Behind me, the chaotic shuffling of desperate people broke the quiet. "Sydney!" The voice was a harsh, guttural roar that bounced off the marble pillars. I stopped and turned slowly. Brandon stormed through the courtroom doors, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. He shoved past a lingering clerk, closing the distance between us in heavy, aggressive strides. The tailored suit he wore suddenly looked like a cheap costume on a frantic, cornered man. He stopped just inches from my face, towering over me, his chest heaving as he tried to use his physical size to force me into submission. It was the same bullying tactic he had used since we were teenagers, relying on intimidation to mask his complete lack of substance. "You ruined my life!" Brandon screamed, spittle flying from his lips. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my eyes. "Do you have any idea what you just did in there? My investors pulled out because of this mess. The press is going to get a hold of this lawsuit, and my entire company is going under because you could not just share the estate like a decent human being. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I simply looked up at him, studying the desperate panic swimming in his eyes. He actually believed his own delusions. He had been told he was a genius for so long that he genuinely thought the collapse of his house of cards was my fault. You never had investors, Brandon, I said, my voice dropping to a cool conversational volume that forced him to stop screaming just to hear me. He blinked, his pointing hand freezing in midair. What are you talking about? I am talking about the illusion you call a career, I continued, folding my arms. You do not have a venture capital-backed tech startup. You never did. You had mom and dad stealing my money to fund your lifestyle. That is a lie, Brandon stammered, looking frantically around the hallway as if searching for an audience to validate him. I have a valuation of over $5 million. We just closed a seed round. You closed a seed round funded entirely by a senile grandmother and a forged home equity line of credit. I corrected, stepping 1 inch closer, invading his personal space. Meredith and I did a full forensic audit of your shell company last week while we were preparing for this hearing. Do you want to know what we found? We found 0 legitimate revenue. We found 0 viable product development. What we did find was a paper trail showing that the initial $200,000 you used to lease your downtown office and buy your sports car came directly from Grandma Josephine's accounts. That was the money Richard stole 10 years ago. He laundered it straight into your fake business to make you look like a prodigy. Brandon's jaw clenched, the color rapidly draining from his flushed face. And when that stolen money dried up, I pressed on, my voice echoing clearly in the empty corridor, because you spent it on luxury vacations and $1,000 dinners to impress your country club friends, Mom and Dad needed a new source of revenue to keep your fake company afloat. That is why they forged my signature on the estate documents. They needed $1 million line of credit to keep playing the role of the wealthy benefactors to their golden child. You are not a CEO, Brandon. You are a 32-year-old dependent living on a stolen allowance. Shut up, Brandon hissed, his voice cracking. He looked over his shoulder. Monique had walked out of the courtroom just in time to hear the entire exchange. She stood a few feet away, clutching her designer handbag, her expression frozen in absolute horror. Monique, do not listen to her, Brandon pleaded, his aggressive posture instantly collapsing into pathetic begging. He reached a hand out toward his wife. She is just trying to get inside my head. She is crazy. My lawyer will fix all of this. Fix what, Brandon? I asked, turning my attention to Monique, allowing the reality of the situation to wash over her. His parents are currently sitting at the defense table inside that room facing criminal fraud charges. They owe me $30,000 by court order. They are officially bankrupt, and the district attorney is going to seize every asset connected to the forged HELOC. That includes the corporate accounts funding your lifestyle. Monique stared at Brandon. The bored, inconvenienced trophy wife facade melted away, replaced by the sharp, terrifying realization of a woman who had just recognized she had been conned. She looked at his expensive watch, his tailored suit, and the utter panic sweating through his pores. Is it true? Monique demanded, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. The penthouse, the trips to Milan, the seed funding you bragged about to my father. Babe, I can explain, Brandon stammered, stepping toward her. It is just a cash flow issue. Once this lawsuit clears up, we will be back on top. Monique stepped directly between Brandon and me, effectively pushing him back. She looked at the man she had married with a mixture of pure, unadulterated disgust and absolute contempt. You are broke, Monique stated, her voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. You do not have a company. You do not have a trust fund. You are nothing but a fraud living off stolen money. Monique, please, Brandon begged, his eyes welling with actual tears. She did not say another word. With quick, sharp movements, Monique reached for her left hand. She gripped the massive, sparkling diamond engagement ring and the matching wedding band, pulling them forcefully off her finger. Take it, she sneered, shoving the heavy platinum rings directly into Brandon's chest. You are probably going to need to pawn these to pay for your parents' bail bondsman. The rings hit his expensive suit jacket and clattered onto the hard marble floor, spinning in tight circles before settling near his leather shoes. Without a single backward glance, Monique turned on her heel and walked away. The sharp, rapid clicking of her stilettos echoed loudly down the courthouse corridor as she marched toward the exit, leaving the wreckage of her marriage behind her on the floor. Brandon stood entirely frozen, staring down at the discarded rings. The arrogant, entitled golden boy who had tormented me for decades was gone. He looked up at me, his face pale, his eyes wide and hollow. He had no money, no company, no wife and parents who were facing imminent incarceration. I looked at him one last time, feeling absolutely nothing. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder, turned, and walked out the heavy glass doors into the bright, freezing afternoon, leaving the golden child entirely alone in the empty hallway. The silence that followed the courthouse showdown lasted exactly 3 weeks. For me, it was a period of intense, focused rebuilding. I poured my energy into expanding my botanical design firm, securing a massive commercial contract to redesign the interior atrium of a new downtown tech campus. For Richard and Patricia, however, those 3 weeks were a rapidly accelerating descent into a legal and financial meat grinder. The district attorney did not just review the forged home equity line of credit documents. He unleashed the full force of the prosecutor's office. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Richard and Patricia were formally indicted on multiple felony charges. The list read like a masterclass in white-collar crime first degree, forgery, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit bank fraud, and attempted grand larceny. Their passports were seized. Their remaining assets, including the sparse bank accounts they had tried to hide, were frozen by court order. The reality of a mandatory state prison sentence had finally crashed through their delusions of grandeur. They were no longer untouchable socialites playing real estate games. They were common criminals facing a decade behind bars. I was in the middle of a client consultation when the storm finally breached my sanctuary. My studio, an airy, glass-walled loft filled with rare orchids, towering monstera plants, and custom terrariums, was designed to be an oasis of calm. The scent of damp earth and jasmine usually kept the atmosphere perfectly serene. That serenity shattered when the heavy glass doors of the lobby violently swung open, banging against the metal stops. I stepped out of my glass-enclosed office just in time to see Patricia aggressively shoving her way past my terrified front desk receptionist. My mother looked entirely unrecognizable. The impeccably tailored woman who used to spend 3 hours a day at the salon was gone. Her designer trench coat was wrinkled and stained at the hem. Her hair was pulled back into a chaotic, messy knot. Her face was flushed, her eyes wide and frantic, darting around the lush green studio like a trapped bird. Sydney. Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the exposed brick walls. My staff froze. 2 high-profile corporate clients who were browsing a portfolio of living walls turned to stare in utter shock. I walked calmly toward the lobby, signaling my security guard to stand by, but hold his position. I stopped 5 feet away from the woman who had locked me out in a blizzard, crossing my arms over my dark green silk blouse. "You are trespassing, Patricia," I stated, my voice low, steady, and carrying zero warmth. "You have exactly 30 seconds to leave my business before my guard escorts you out, and I add a harassment charge to your growing list of legal problems." Patricia completely ignored the warning. She lunged forward, grabbing the edge of a custom mahogany display table, her knuckles turning white. "You have to stop this, Sydney!" she pleaded, her voice cracking into a desperate guttural sob. "You have to call the prosecutor right now. They are taking everything." The bank froze the accounts. "Richard is talking about taking a plea deal that involves a 5-year sentence. 5 years. He will not survive in a state penitentiary, and I cannot go to jail. I simply cannot do it." I stared at her, feeling a profound, absolute emptiness where my daughterly affection used to reside. She was not apologizing for stealing from me. She was not apologizing for the cruelty, the eviction, or the lies. She was only crying because she had finally been caught, and the consequences were actively destroying her life. "You forged my signature on a $1 million bank loan," I replied smoothly, ensuring every word was crystal clear for the audience in my lobby. You attempted to steal my inheritance to fund Brandon's fake company, and then you tried to extort me for $30,000 to leave a property you had no legal right to occupy. What exactly did you think was going to happen when the judge saw the evidence? Patricia fell to her knees right there on the polished concrete floor. The display was so pathetic, so entirely devoid of dignity, that several of my employees actually looked away in secondhand embarrassment. "We will do anything," she wailed, tears streaming down her face, pooling in the deep lines around her mouth. "Please, Sydney, I am begging you. We will work for you. We will clean this studio. We will pay you back every single cent for the rest of our lives. Just pick up the phone. Just call the district attorney and tell them it was all a big misunderstanding. Tell them we had a family disagreement and that you are dropping the charges." She reached out, trying to grab the hem of my trousers. I took a deliberate step backward, keeping myself entirely out of her reach. Her hands grasped at empty air. "You still do not understand the reality of your situation," I said, looking down at her frantic, tear-streaked face. "You still think you can manipulate your way out of a felony by bullying me in public." Patricia looked up, her breath hitching a desperate glimmer of hope sparking in her eyes, assuming my hesitation meant I was considering her absurd offer. "It is out of my hands, Mom," I stated, my voice slicing through her manufactured hysteria like a blade. "I could not drop the charges even if I wanted to, and for the record, I absolutely do not want to." Patricia froze, the tears instantly stopping as confusion washed over her features. "What do you mean you cannot drop them? You are the victim. You have to tell them to stop." "I am a witness," I corrected coldly. "The victim in this specific criminal case is the First National Bank. The state completely took over the case because you defrauded a federally insured financial institution. You did not just mess with me, Patricia. You messed with the federal government. The district attorney is using you and Richard to make an aggressive, highly public example out of white-collar real estate fraud. They are going to prosecute you to the absolute fullest extent of the law, and I am going to sit in the front row of the gallery and watch them do it." The color instantly vanished from my mother's face, leaving her looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. "Security," I called out, never breaking eye contact with the woman on the floor. "Please escort this woman off the premises. If she resists, call the police and inform them that an indicted felon out on bail is violating a trespass warning." My guard stepped forward, firmly gripping Patricia by the arm and pulling her to her feet. She did not fight him. She did not scream. The horrifying realization that her charm, her tears, and her manipulation were completely useless against the crushing weight of the federal justice system had finally broken her. She stumbled out the glass doors, a ruined, empty shell of a woman disappearing into the crowded city streets. The morning air was crisp and unforgiving as two county sheriff cruisers parked at sharp angles across the circular cobblestone driveway of the estate. Their blue lights flashed rhythmically, casting harsh shadows against the historic brick facade. This was the final, undeniable reality of Judge Davis's ruling. The court had granted Richard, Patricia, and Brandon exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises, but today was the supervised move out. They were permitted precisely 4 hours under police escort to gather their personal belongings. The stipulations were brutally clear. They could take personal clothing, toiletries, and cheap, non-luxury electronics. Every piece of antique furniture, every Persian rug, the grand piano, and the extensive art collection belonged solely to Josephine's blind trust. I stood on the wraparound porch with my arms crossed, flanked by an independent inventory auditor and a third police officer. We watched as a battered, rust-colored U-Haul truck sputtered down the oak-lined street and turned into the driveway. The sheer humiliation of the moment hung thick in the air. There was no sleek Mercedes, no imported sports car. Richard killed the engine, and the three of them stepped out of the heavy commercial cab. Patricia looked physically ill. She stared up at the estate she had treated as her personal kingdom, her face ashen. Brandon slammed the passenger door, his shoulders hunched against the morning chill, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The lead officer, a tall, no-nonsense man named Sergeant Miller, met them at the base of the steps. He handed Richard a roll of heavy-duty black contractor garbage bags, The vintage leather steamer trunks and designer luggage sets were property of the estate purchased with stolen trust funds. They would have to pack their lives into plastic trash bags. For the next 3 hours, the grand historic house was reduced to a sterile processing center. The officers followed them room to room, watching their every move with bored vigilance. I remained on the main floor, listening to the heavy thud of footsteps upstairs. Patricia wept openly in the master suite. As the auditor denied her request to take a velvet chaise lounge she claimed she had purchased herself. The auditor simply pointed to the corresponding receipt in the trust ledger and instructed her to keep moving. Richard packed in complete hollow silence. He dragged black plastic bags filled with slacks and sweaters down the grand staircase, his face devoid of any emotion. He looked like a man who had finally realized he was entirely out of moves. But the true spectacle was happening outside the property line. The flashing police lights had acted as a beacon for the affluent, incredibly nosy residents of the neighborhood. These were the same people Patricia had spent the last decade trying to impress. Mrs. Gable, the formidable president of the local country club, stood at the end of her manicured driveway, clutching a steaming mug of coffee. Beside her stood the wives of two prominent bank executives. They were openly watching as Patricia Wilson, the woman who used to host lavish catered garden parties, dragged a black garbage bag full of shoes across the wet asphalt and heaved it into the back of a rented U-Haul. It was absolute social death broadcast live to the exact audience Patricia feared most. She tried to hide her face behind her messy hair, her shoulders shaking with fresh sobs as she scrambled back inside the house. As the 4-hour window neared its end, the tension inside the estate reached a boiling point. Brandon was the last to come downstairs. He moved quickly, his jaw tight, carrying a bulky rectangular object wrapped heavily in a thick wool coat. He kept his head down, aiming straight for the front doors. "Hold on a second," Sergeant Miller said, stepping squarely into Brandon's path. The officer's voice was calm, but carried an undeniable edge of authority. "Let me see what you have wrapped up there." "It is just a mirror," Brandon snapped, his voice pitching higher with panic. "It is my personal property. Move out of my way. I am just trying to leave." Sergeant Miller did not move an inch. "Put it on the table and unwrap it," he commanded. Brandon hesitated, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit. He clutched the object tighter to his chest. "I said it is mine. You have no right to search my personal items." The officer placed his hand deliberately on his heavy utility belt. "I will not ask you again, son. Put it on the table." Slowly, his hands shaking violently, Brandon lowered the object onto the mahogany console table. He pulled back the folds of the wool coat. Beneath it lay a stunning original oil painting of a coastal landscape. It was a piece Josephine had purchased from a local artist decades ago, recently appraised at over $5,000. The inventory auditor stepped forward, flipping open his heavy binder. He ran a finger down a laminated page. "Item 412, the auditor stated clearly. "Original coastal oil painting, property of the Josephine Blind Trust." "I bought that," Brandon lied, his voice cracking loudly. "She gave it to me as a gift. It is mine." "You are actively under indictment for felony fraud," Sergeant Miller said, his tone turning dangerously cold. "Do you really want me to add attempted grand larceny to your jacket right now? Put the painting down and step out of the house." Brandon stared at the painting, then up at the officer. The illusion he had clung to the belief that he was somehow superior, untouchable, and deserving of this wealth shattered completely. He shoved past the officer and bolted out the front door. I walked out onto this porch just in time to watch him fall apart. The golden child did not make it to the truck. He collapsed right in the middle of the manicured front lawn. He dropped to his knees in the damp grass, buried his face in his hands, and began to wail. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was the loud, gasping, uncontrolled sobbing of a spoiled child who had finally been told no. He beat his fists against the ground, screaming incoherently about how unfair everything was, while his parents watched helplessly from the back of the moving truck. The wealthy neighbors watched the entire meltdown with wide, shocked eyes. I stood perfectly still on the wraparound porch, my hands resting lightly on the polished wooden railing. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched in absolute silence as the people who had tried to destroy me were loaded into a rented truck and driven away from my home forever. The low grinding hum of the rented moving truck faded down the long oak-lined driveway, eventually swallowed completely by the ambient noise of the city. For the first time in my entire life, the historic estate was enveloped in absolute unbroken silence. The suffocating weight of my parents' presence had lifted, leaving behind a profound stillness that felt incredibly foreign. I turned away from the porch railing and walked back through the heavy mahogany front doors, the grand foyer usually echoing with Patricia's shrill demands or Richard's booming manufactured authority was completely still. I stood in the center of the marble floor and took a deep breath. The air inside still smelled faintly of stale cigar smoke and expensive heavy perfume. It was the lingering scent of entitlement. It was time to scrub them from the walls. I did not wait for my contractors. I walked straight into the formal dining room, grabbed the edge of Patricia's heavy, tacky burgundy velvet curtains and pulled. The reinforced fabric ripped away from the brass rod with a satisfying violent tear, bringing the entire track crashing to the hardwood floor. Sunlight flooded the room instantly, illuminating dust motes dancing in the sudden brightness. I moved from room to room, tearing down every oppressive drape, every suffocating shade they had installed to keep the world out. Next came the junk removal team. I stood in the center of Richard's designated study, directing the crew to haul away the massive, foul-smelling leather cigar chairs he had bought to make himself feel like a titan of industry. The actual antique furniture, the pieces Josephine had carefully curated and placed into the trust, remained perfectly intact. But the cheap, gaudy modifications my parents had brought in to mask their lack of taste were dragged out the front door and tossed unceremoniously into a commercial dumpster. With every piece of trash removed, the estate seemed to breathe easier. I know I certainly did. But true healing required more than just throwing away the past. It required building something new. I walked out the back doors and across the sprawling lawn toward the carriage house. Just a few months ago, this was the site of my ultimate humiliation. This was the door they had locked behind me during a freezing Thanksgiving blizzard, leaving me to freeze while they laughed inside. Now it was the foundation of my future. My botanical design team arrived the next morning, pulling up in a fleet of commercial vans. We did not just clean the carriage house, we completely gutted the interior. The dark, cramped walls Brandon had insisted on keeping were smashed into drywall dust by swinging sledgehammers. We ripped open the roof and installed massive industrial-grade skylights, allowing natural sunlight to pour into the space from dawn until dusk. We brought in long, raw wood drafting tables, deep porcelain sinks, and miles of copper shelving. Then came the life. My team unloaded delivery after delivery of rare flora. We hung trailing pothos and vibrant philodendrons from the exposed wooden beams. We arranged delicate blooming orchids in climate-controlled glass terrariums. We potted massive bird of paradise plants and towering fiddle-leaf figs that reached toward the new skylights. Within a week, the cold, miserable structure where I had been evicted was transformed into a lush, thriving, oxygen-rich design studio. The smell of damp soil, fresh green leaves, and blooming jasmine entirely erased the bitter memory of the winter storm. I was no longer hiding in the shadows of the estate. I was flourishing right in the center of it. With the studio fully operational, I directed my renovation crew to begin addressing the deferred maintenance inside the main house. Richard and Patricia had spent decades pretending to be wealthy, which meant they only spent money on things their country club friends could see. The structural integrity of the upper floors had been completely ignored. I sent the demolition team to the east wing directly into the massive suite Brandon had occupied rent-free for his entire adult life. I was reviewing a commercial landscape contract in my new studio when my foreman called my cell phone. His voice sounded tight, completely lacking his usual boisterous energy. He asked me to come up to the second floor immediately. I found the crew standing awkwardly in the center of Brandon's oversized walk-in closet. The back wall had been stripped of its custom shelving, revealing the bare drywall behind it. But the drywall was not uniform. A large rectangular section had been neatly cut out and covered with a false magnetic panel. The foreman reached forward and pulled the panel away. Hidden perfectly between the wooden wall studs was a heavy steel combination safe. Brandon had claimed he possessed zero assets when the court ordered him to vacate. He had stood on the front lawn sobbing about having absolutely nothing. I did not waste time calling him. I called a professional locksmith. It took the technician 45 minutes and a high-powered industrial drill to bypass the locking mechanism. The heavy steel door swung open with a harsh metallic groan. I stepped forward expecting to find hidden cash, or perhaps the corporate documents he used for his fake tech company. Instead, the safe was completely empty of money. Lying at the bottom of the steel box was a thick, disorganized stack of yellowing paper. I reached in and pulled the stack out. They were receipts, dozens of them. I flipped through the stiff, carbon-copied papers, my blood running entirely cold, as I read the stamped letterheads. They were from high-end pawn shops and private estate jewelers located 3 towns over. I read the handwritten inventory descriptions carefully scrawled on each ticket. A vintage emerald and platinum brooch, a diamond tennis bracelet with a broken clasp, a heavy antique gold wedding band. My stomach plummeted. These were not random items. These were the exact descriptions of Grandma Josephine's most prized, valuable heirloom jewelry. For years, Patricia had loudly and tragically complained to anyone who would listen that Josephine had started losing her mind and misplacing her valuables in her old age. Patricia had used those missing items as the primary justification for seeking medical control over my grandmother. The betrayal ran so much deeper than corporate fraud or a forged line of credit. They had not just stolen her business capital. Brandon and my parents had systematically robbed their own mother of her personal heirlooms, fenced them in neighboring towns, and then used the resulting disappearances to falsely paint her as senile. They had built their entire empire on the physical and emotional cannibalization of the woman who gave them everything. The pawnshop receipts were the final devastating nail in the coffin. I did not confront my parents or Brandon with my discovery. I did not give them the opportunity to manufacture excuses or spin another web of lies. I simply placed the thick stack of yellowing paper into a secure manila folder and handed it directly to the district attorney. The prosecutor used the newly unearthed evidence of calculated elder abuse and theft to utterly crush whatever remaining legal defense my parents had left. 6 months later, I sat in the front row of the gallery in the county courthouse. The air inside the courtroom smelled of floor wax and old wood, heavy with the sterile, unforgiving machinery of the justice system. The heavy oak doors at the side of the room swung open, and Richard and Patricia were led to the defense table by a bailiff. They were not wearing handcuffs, but they moved as if they carried heavy iron chains. The bespoke suits and designer dresses were gone. Patricia wore a plain, inexpensive beige blouse that washed out her complexion, and Richard wore a faded gray jacket that hung loosely off his diminishing frame. They looked incredibly small, entirely stripped of the arrogant authority they had used to terrorize me for years. The defense attorney had spent weeks begging the prosecutor for leniency. Because it was their first criminal offense, and due to their advancing age, the district attorney had offered a final plea deal. If they took the deal, they avoided a mandatory 10-year sentence in a state penitentiary. Facing the absolute certainty of dying in a concrete cell, they took the plea without a single moment of hesitation. The presiding judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for white-collar entitlement, looked down at them from the elevated bench. Her expression was one of profound disgust as she read the terms of the agreement into the official public record. Richard and Patricia Wilson, she began, her voice projecting sharply across the silent room. You have pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges, including wire fraud, first-degree forgery, and conspiracy. The evidence presented to this court demonstrates a breathtaking level of greed and manipulation. You stole from a federally insured financial institution, you systematically robbed your own mother of her heirlooms, and you attempted to financially ruin your daughter. Patricia squeezed her eyes shut, her shoulders trembling violently as the judge listed their crimes for the public record. Richard stared blankly at the polished wooden table in front of him. The judge continued, slamming the final nail into their social coffin. I am accepting this plea arrangement, but do not mistake this for leniency. You are hereby sentenced to 5 years of strict supervised probation. You are ordered to complete 1,000 hours of community service specifically assigned to the Municipal Parks and Sanitation Department. Furthermore, the court is imposing crippling restitution fines that will garnish any future income you manage to acquire. The gavel cracked against the sounding block. It was official. My parents were convicted felons. The ramifications of that single strike were absolute and irreversible. Their country club memberships were instantly and permanently revoked. Their entire social circle, the wealthy neighbors, the bank executives, and the affluent society wives they had spent decades trying to impress severed all contact overnight. They would never pass a basic employment background check. They lost their right to vote. Their passports were heavily restricted. They would spend the next 5 years submitting to random drug tests and weekly check-ins with a gruff probation officer. Their social standing was not just damaged, it was permanently eradicated. They would spend their weekends wearing bright orange safety vests, picking up trash along the county highways in full view of the public. Before the hearing officially concluded, the judge looked directly at me. The court recognizes the primary victim in this case. Miss Wilson, do you wish to make a statement? I stood up from the hard wooden bench and smoothed the front of my dark green tailored dress. The gallery was dead silent as I walked down the center aisle and took my place at the podium. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not display a single ounce of the manufactured hysteria Patricia had weaponized throughout my entire childhood. I adjusted the microphone, looking directly at the defense table. Patricia stared at the floor, tears streaming down her pale cheeks, unable to look at the daughter she had thrown out into a blizzard. Richard sat completely rigid, his eyes locked onto his own shaking hands, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched in his cheek. I spoke with chilling absolute calm, my voice echoing clearly off the high vaulted ceilings. For years, the people sitting at that table used manipulation, theft, and cruelty to maintain a desperate illusion of wealth. They stole from the woman who raised them, fencing her personal heirlooms to fund a lavish lifestyle while claiming she was losing her mind. They stole from a bank. They stole my inheritance and attempted to steal my future. They locked me out in a freezing storm and demanded a ransom for a home they had zero legal right to occupy. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, forcing the air to grow heavy. I wanted them to feel the crushing weight of every single word. They made me pay to be abused in my own home, I stated, my voice slicing through the quiet room like a surgical blade. Today the debt is settled. I stepped away from the podium without waiting for a response. I did not look back. Richard could not even lift his head. He was utterly broken, a hollow shell of a man entirely destroyed by his own hubris. I walked out of the courtroom, pushing through the heavy double doors into the bright, warm afternoon sunlight, leaving them behind to face the total ruin they had built with their own hands. The afternoon sun felt incredible on my face as I walked away from the county courthouse, but the peace of the moment was briefly interrupted by a notification on my phone. It was an automated email from the municipal clerk. Brandon had officially filed a small claims lawsuit against me. With Richard and Patricia stripped of their wealth and facing years of grueling probation, my brother was entirely out of safety nets. The bank of Mom and Dad was permanently closed. His fraudulent tech startup had evaporated the moment the district attorney seized the fake corporate accounts. Desperation breeds delusion, and Brandon was the most delusional of them all. He was suing me for exactly $10,000, which was the maximum limit for small claims court in our jurisdiction. The stated reason on the filing was sweat equity and property management compensation. He genuinely believed he deserved to be paid for the years he spent living rent-free on our grandmother's estate, destroying the property I had painstakingly restored. 2 weeks later, I found myself sitting in a cramped, brightly lit municipal courtroom. Small claims court lacked the heavy oak and dramatic weight of the criminal courts. It resembled a sterile municipal waiting room filled with frustrated landlords and bickering neighbors. I sat alone at the defendant's table, wearing a sharp charcoal blazer. I did not hire an attorney. I did not need one. Brandon sat at the plaintiff's table looking utterly frantic. His designer suit hung loosely on his frame, unpressed and stained at the cuff. He kept shifting his weight, bouncing his knee rapidly, and glaring at me across the center aisle. When the municipal judge finally called our case, Brandon leaped to his feet. "Your Honor." Brandon began attempting to project his old manufactured confidence. "For years I acted as the primary caretaker of the carriage house property. I maintained the grounds. I managed the upkeep. I invested my own sweat equity into improving the space. When my sister illegally locked me out, she essentially stole the value of my labor. I am simply asking for fair compensation for the improvements I made to her estate." The judge, an older man with tired eyes and zero patience for nonsense, peered over his reading glasses. He looked at Brandon, then turned his gaze to me. "Miss Wilson, how do you respond to the plaintiff's claims of property improvement?" I stood up slowly and picked up a heavy black 3-ring binder from my table. I approached the bench and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. "I respond with photographic evidence, Your Honor," I stated, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Inside that binder, you will find date-stamped photographs of the carriage house, taken the exact morning of the court-ordered eviction." The judge opened the binder. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the thick plastic pages turning. "You will see the holes the plaintiff punched into the drywall," I continued calmly. "You will see the burn marks on the original hardwood floors. You will see the rotting garbage left piled in the corners, and the custom cabinetry he tore out in a fit of rage. Furthermore, if you turn to tab 3, you will find unpaid utility bills totaling over $2,000, all listed under his name, which I had to settle out of my own pocket to restore power to the building. Tab 4 contains the invoices from the hazardous waste removal team I had to hire just to make the space safe to breathe in." Brandon's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He gripped the edge of his table. "That is a total lie," he shouted, his voice cracking in the small room. "She staged those photos. She is just trying to ruin me like she ruined our parents." The judge slammed his hand down flat on the open binder. The sharp crack echoed loudly, instantly silencing my brother. "Mr. Wilson." The judge warned, his voice dangerously low. "I have been sitting on this bench for 20 years. Do not insult my intelligence by claiming these structural damages were staged. You are asking this court to award you $10,000 for destroying a property you had absolutely no legal right to occupy. It was my house." Brandon snapped back, completely losing his grip on reality. "I was the golden child. I was the one who was supposed to inherit it." "Your entitlement is not legally binding," the judge replied sharply. "This case is entirely without merit. In fact, Miss Wilson would be well within her rights to countersue you for the cost of these repairs. Case dismissed with prejudice. Do not waste this court's time again, Mr. Wilson." The entire proceeding had lasted exactly 8 minutes. Brandon stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing as the judge called the next case. He grabbed his disorganized stack of papers, shoved them into his battered leather briefcase, and stormed down the center aisle. I gathered my things at a leisurely pace and followed him out into the bustling municipal hallway. Brandon was pacing near the elevator banks, his hands pulling frantically at his hair. He turned and saw me approaching. "Are you happy now?" he snarled, stepping directly into my path. "You took everything. I have absolutely nothing left. My accounts are empty. I cannot even afford to put gas in my car. You destroyed your own flesh and blood." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold closure. "I did not destroy you, Brandon. I simply stopped paying for your life. You destroyed yourself the moment you decided my hard work belonged to you." Before he could formulate another pathetic excuse, the heavy glass doors of the courthouse swung open. A man in a sharp gray suit walked purposefully toward us. He held a thick manila envelope in his right hand. He bypassed me completely and stepped directly in front of my brother. "Brandon Wilson?" the man asked. Brandon scowled at him. "Who is asking?" The man pressed the thick envelope firmly against Brandon's chest. "You have been served." Brandon fumbled with the envelope, ripping the top open. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. His eyes scanned the first page, and all the remaining color drained from his face. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I am a representative for Monique's legal counsel, the man stated smoothly. She is filing for immediate dissolution of marriage. Enclosed is also an emergency court order freezing all joint assets, as well as a garnishment order targeting your personal checking account for unpaid marital debts. Monique was a shark. She had married Brandon for his supposed proximity to wealth. Now that he was a penniless, unemployed fraud with a criminal family, she was severing ties with ruthless, calculated efficiency. She was not just leaving him. She had instructed her lawyers to drain the very last dollars he had hidden away in his personal accounts. Brandon stared at the divorce papers, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped them. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely hollow. He had no parents left to bail him out. He had no wife to support his delusions. He had no home, no money, and no future. He was finally and truly, entirely destitute. I stepped onto the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and watched the heavy metal doors slide shut on my brother's ruined life. 6 months passed in a blur of rampant, unchecked growth. With the toxic weight of my family finally excised from my life, I poured every ounce of my energy into my botanical design firm. The downtown tech campus atrium project was a massive success, earning a feature in a prominent architectural digest. That single article created a domino effect. Within weeks, my firm was booked solid for the next 2 years, securing contracts with boutique hotels, upscale restaurants, and private residential estates across the city. The carriage house, once my freezing prison, was now the beating heart of my operation. It was a sun-drenched, oxygen-rich sanctuary filled with drafting tables, soil bins, and hundreds of thriving exotic plants. But the most profound transformation had taken place inside the main estate. With the legal battles definitively concluded, I had finally reclaimed my grandmother's home. I spent the spring months undoing decades of Patricia's superficial damage. The heavy, oppressive velvet drapes were gone. The gaudy imitation gold fixtures were ripped out and replaced with clean, modern lines that complemented Josephine's original antique furniture. I opened every window, allowing the ocean breeze to sweep through the long corridors, permanently banishing the stale smell of Richard's cigars and my mother's heavy perfume. To mark the official rebirth of the estate, I decided to host a garden gala. I wanted to fill the grounds with light laughter and people who actually cared about one another. The contrast between my gala and the parties my parents used to throw was absolute. Patricia's gatherings had always been rigid, performative events. They were stressful, high-stakes theatrical productions designed to project an illusion of extreme wealth. Guests would stand around stiffly judging one another over sterile plates of overpriced caviar and ice sculptures, terrified of making a social misstep. My gala was entirely different. I hired a local farm-to-table catering company that set up rustic wooden tasting stations across the sprawling back lawn. A lively jazz quartet played warmly from the wraparound porch, their music blending perfectly with the sound of the distant ocean. I draped thousands of warm white string lights through the branches of the ancient oak trees, casting a soft golden glow over the entire property. The estate was filled with massive custom floral installations my team and I had designed specifically for the occasion, featuring night-blooming jasmine, cascading orchids, and vibrant birds of paradise. The guest list consisted of my dedicated staff, my loyal clients, and the people who had stood by me when I had absolutely nothing. Meredith, my fierce and brilliant attorney, arrived wearing a stunning emerald green pantsuit. She was laughing loudly, holding a glass of champagne, completely off the clock, and thoroughly enjoying the atmosphere. Beside her stood Mr. Thorne, the meticulous independent auditor and estate trustee, who had helped me uncover the depths of my family's financial crimes. He looked incredibly relaxed, having traded his usual stiff business suits for a tailored linen jacket. I walked across the lawn to greet them, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. Meredith pulled me into a warm embrace, carefully avoiding spilling her drink. "You threw a spectacular party," Sydney Meredith said, her eyes scanning the glowing gardens. "This house finally feels alive. It feels exactly the way it was always meant to feel." Mr. Thorne raised his glass toward me in a quiet salute. Your grandmother would be incredibly proud of you, Sydney. You did not just protect her legacy, you completely revitalized it. She always knew you had the spine to do what needed to be done. I smiled, clinking my glass against theirs. I could not have done any of it without the two of you. You gave me the tools to fight back when I was entirely backed into a corner. Tonight is a celebration for all of us. I spent the next 2 hours moving seamlessly through the crowd. There was no posturing, no fake pleasantries, and no hidden agendas. I watched my lead botanical designer dancing barefoot on the grass. I saw my newest corporate client sharing a plate of artisan cheeses with my security guard. It was a gathering of a chosen family built on genuine respect and shared joy rather than bloodlines and financial manipulation. As the evening approached midnight, the jazz quartet began packing up their instruments and the catering staff started quietly clearing the empty plates. I excused myself from a conversation with my foreman and walked up the steps of the back porch, seeking a brief moment of quiet reflection. I stood near the railing looking out over the illuminated gardens. The air was cool and smelled sweetly of blooming jasmine. I pulled my cell phone from the pocket of my blazer to check the time. The screen glowed brightly in the shadows of the porch. A single new notification rested at the top of the display. It was an email from a random, unfamiliar address, but the subject line consisted of just one word: Sydney. I tapped the screen, unlocking the phone and opening the message. It was a short block of text, devoid of any formal greeting. I am working night shifts at a grocery store. Your father's back is giving out from the highway cleanups. We lost the rental apartment. We have absolutely nothing left. Please, Sydney. I stared at the glowing letters for a long moment. I did not feel a sudden rush of guilt. I did not feel a familiar, conditioned urge to rescue them from the consequences of their own actions. The words were a calculated attempt to manufacture pity, a desperate play from a woman who had once stood in a luxury kitchen and told me I deserved to freeze on the streets. They had fenced my grandmother's jewelry, drained her accounts, forged bank loans, and tried to strip me of everything I owned just to fund their vanity. Now stripped of their stolen wealth and their country club status, they were finally experiencing the exact reality they had so casually tried to inflict upon me. I did not type a reply. I did not forward the message to my lawyer. I simply pressed the delete button, watching the email vanish permanently into the digital trash bin. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. From the lawn below, Meredith called my name, waving a fresh glass of champagne in my direction. I turned away from the dark edges of the property, stepped back into the warmth of the light, and walked down the stairs to join my real family. I stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs, the lively jazz music washing over me. My hand was still buried deep in my blazer pocket, my fingers tightly gripping the cold metal of my phone. I had deleted the email. I had intended to walk away. But a deeply ingrained, insidious reflex suddenly seized my chest. It was guilt. It was the heavy, suffocating conditioning that Patricia and Richard had spent 3 decades installing in my brain. They had trained me from childhood to be their emotional sponge and their ultimate safety net. A tiny, treacherous voice in the back of my mind whispered that they were suffering. I pictured Richard, a man who once arrogantly wore custom-tailored suits, groaning in pain as he struggled to lift heavy trash bags on the side of a public highway. I pictured Patricia, whose biggest concern used to be the thread count of her imported table linen, standing on her aching feet for 8 hours under the harsh fluorescent lights of a grocery store checkout lane. They were completely stripped of their dignity. They had no home. They had no money. The conditioned guilt tried to convince me that they had finally been punished enough. They were still my parents, the voice reasoned. Surely letting them sleep on the street was a step too far. I took a sharp breath of the cool ocean air and closed my eyes. The moment I did, the illusion of their victimhood was instantly and permanently obliterated by the memory of my own. I was no longer standing in a warm, beautifully illuminated garden. I was back on the front porch on Thanksgiving morning. I felt the biting, violent sting of the blizzard cutting through my thin clothes. I heard the sharp metallic snap of the heavy brass deadbolt sliding into place as my mother locked me out in the freezing snow. I remembered the burning numbness in my fingers as I huddled in the unheated, dilapidated carriage house, praying I would not freeze to death on my own property. I remembered Brandon holding a sledgehammer, gleefully smashing through the drywall of the carriage house, while Patricia stood by and cheered him on. I remembered the hollow pit in my stomach when I opened that hidden steel safe and found the pawnshop receipts. That was the undeniable proof that my parents had systematically cannibalized my grandmother's legacy, fencing her cherished heirlooms to neighboring towns, while falsely labeling her senile to the state. They did not feel a single ounce of guilt when they were actively trying to destroy my life. They had laughed while I suffered. Their current desperation was not a tragedy. It was a direct earned consequence of their own malicious greed. I pulled my phone back out of my pocket. The screen illuminated the darkness of the lower steps. I opened my trash folder and restored Patricia's message. I did not want to leave the matter unresolved, lingering like a silent ghost in the digital ether. They needed to know with absolute certainty that the door was permanently closed. I tapped the reply button. The cursor blinked steadily against the blank white screen. I did not type a long paragraph detailing my pain. I did not demand an apology they were entirely incapable of giving. I did not offer a single word of sympathy or anger. I typed a single definitive sentence. Enjoy figuring life out. I pressed send. I watched the blue progress bar shoot across the top of the screen until the message vanished into the outbox. Then I opened my security settings. I permanently blocked Patricia's email address. I entered Richard's old email and blocked that as well. I went into my phone carrier settings and placed a hard network block on any phone numbers associated with them, including Brandon's old number. I systematically severed every remaining digital thread connecting them to my existence. The heavy, suffocating anchor in my chest instantly dissolved. It was replaced by a profound, soaring lightness. The final boundary was drawn in permanent ink. I slid the phone back into my pocket, this time for good. I walked away from the shadows of the porch and stepped back onto the sprawling, vibrant lawn. The garden gala was in full swing, pulsing with a bright, authentic energy that this property had not seen in decades. Meredith was laughing at a joke Mr. Thorne had made, her head thrown back in genuine, uninhibited joy. My lead botanical designer was dancing barefoot on the grass with her partner. My design team was gathered around the large stone fire pit, sharing stories and toasting to the massive success of our firm. There was no tension. There was no fear of judgment or performative posturing. The air was crisp, clean, and filled with the magnificent scent of blooming jasmine and sea salt. This was my chosen family, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared triumph. I stopped in the center of the lawn and turned back to look at the grand estate. The warm, golden interior lights glowed beautifully through the massive antique stained glass window overlooking the main staircase. It was the exact window Grandma Josephine had loved to sit by every morning. For a brief, breathtaking second, the shifting light from the chandelier inside seemed to catch the colored glass perfectly, creating the distinct, elegant silhouette of a woman standing proudly in the frame. I smiled, raising my glass of champagne toward the glowing window. Josephine's legacy was finally safe, and so was I. Across town, nestled in a plush velvet booth at an exclusive rooftop bar, Monique was already hard at work securing her next host. She sat across from an older, silver-haired man wearing a heavy platinum watch. She delicately swirled an olive in her martini glass, projecting the perfect image of a wounded, tragic heroine. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with manufactured vulnerability, and complained about the horrific ordeal she had just survived. She spun a masterful tale of deception, claiming she had been ruthlessly scammed by a sociopathic fraudster who hid his impending bankruptcy behind a wall of fake corporate documents. She painted Brandon as a master manipulator who had drained her personal accounts and left her with severe emotional trauma. The older man reached across the table and patted her hand sympathetically, entirely unaware that the woman sitting across from him had just ruthlessly gutted her ex-husband for his last remaining pennies. Monique had learned absolutely nothing from the wreckage, effortlessly pivoting to her next target without a single ounce of remorse. Brandon, meanwhile, was experiencing a very different kind of reality. The stale, greasy scent of cold French fries permeated the cabin of his heavily dented leased compact car. He stared at the cracked screen of his mounted cell phone, waiting for the delivery app to process his next route. The screen flashed green, displaying a pickup order from a fast food chain and a delivery address that made his stomach plummet. It was an address located deep inside the Heights, the ultra-wealthy gated enclave, where he used to spend his weekends driving around pretending to shop for summer homes. He had no choice. He accepted the order. 30 minutes later, Brandon pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of a sprawling modern mansion. He trudged up the long, perfectly manicured stone driveway, carrying two large brown paper bags that were leaking grease onto his cheap canvas sneakers. He caught his reflection in the mirrored glass of the massive double front doors. The bespoke suits and confident swagger were gone. He looked incredibly haggard, his shoulders slumped, wearing a stained promotional t-shirt and a faded baseball cap pulled low over his eyes to avoid recognition. A teenager opened the door, grabbed the bags without making eye contact, and slammed the heavy door shut in his face. Brandon stood on the stone porch for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of wealth and laughter echoing from inside the house. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a notification from the delivery app. He had received a $2 tip. He turned and walked back to his beat-up car, entirely invisible in the world he used to claim he ruled. Miles away, the late afternoon sun was beating down mercilessly on the shoulder of Interstate 95. The heat radiating off the dark asphalt was absolutely unforgiving. Richard and Patricia moved slowly along the gravel shoulder, clad in oversized, sweat-stained neon orange safety vests. The words "community service" were printed in thick, bold black letters across their backs. Cars and transport trucks whipped past at 70 miles an hour, blasting them with hot exhaust fumes and kicking up clouds of dirty dust. Patricia's hands, once perfectly manicured and adorned with the heavy heirloom rings she had stolen from her own mother, were now blistered and raw inside cheap canvas work gloves. She stabbed blindly at a discarded soda cup with her aluminum trash grabber, missing it twice before finally securing it and dropping it into her bag. Richard was a few yards ahead of her, dragging a heavy black plastic garbage bag along the rough gravel. He was panting heavily, his face flushed a dangerous mottled red under the harsh sun. A county sheriff cruiser was parked 50 yards behind them, the deputy leaning against the hood, ensuring the probationers did not stop working. Richard and Patricia did not speak to each other. The resentment between them had festered into a suffocating, toxic fog. Their former country club friends were likely sitting on a shaded terrace, sipping iced cocktails right now, while they picked up fast food wrappers and discarded cigarette boxes from the gutter. They had spent their entire lives looking down on manual laborers, viewing them as entirely beneath their social class. Now they were the ones wearing neon vests, publicly humiliated on the side of a noisy highway. A low, powerful rumble approached from the westbound lane. It was not the usual chaotic roar of a commercial semi-truck. Patricia paused, wiping the sweat from her forehead with the back of her canvas glove, and looked up. A fleet of 3 pristine charcoal gray commercial vehicles was driving past in perfect formation. They were massive, heavily customized transport trucks, hauling incredibly expensive, mature, exotic trees and custom copper planters toward a high-end commercial district downtown. On the side of the lead truck, catching the harsh afternoon sun perfectly, was a massive, elegant logo rendered in gleaming gold leaf. It bore the name of my botanical design firm. Patricia stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes widened, tracking the gleaming gold letters as the trucks roared past, kicking up a strong gust of wind that rustled her oversized neon vest. The reality of the moment crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. The daughter she had constantly mocked, the child she had labeled a glorified lawnmower and thrown out into a blizzard, was now commanding a fleet of luxury design vehicles. I was quite literally paving the city with gold while she stood in the dirt picking up trash. The aluminum trash grabber slipped from Patricia's trembling fingers, hitting the asphalt with a hollow metallic clatter as she stood entirely frozen in the dust. Exactly 1 year had passed since the day my life was supposed to end. I woke up on Thanksgiving morning to the soft golden light of late autumn streaming through the massive bay windows of the master bedroom. I did not wake up shivering violently on a damp cot in an unheated carriage house. I woke up in Grandma Josephine's antique four-poster bed, wrapped in heavy, luxurious down comforters. The estate was completely silent for only a few minutes before the pleasant, chaotic energy of the holiday began to unfold. I walked downstairs, my bare feet sinking into the thick plush rugs I had carefully selected to replace Patricia's sterile, pretentious marble flooring. The house smelled incredibly warm. It was a rich, savory blend of roasting turkey, fresh sage, sweet cinnamon, and the sharp, clean scent of the fresh pine garlands my botanical team had draped across the grand staircase and over the stone fireplaces. Last year, this house was a frozen mausoleum of fake wealth, forced compliance, and vicious hostility. Today it was a vibrant sanctuary of genuine joy. I spent the entire morning in the sprawling, modernized kitchen, alongside my lead botanical designer and my construction foreman. We were not discussing profit margins or stressful corporate contracts. We were laughing loudly over a massive ceramic bowl of homemade stuffing, drinking steaming mugs of hot apple cider, and completely ignoring the rigid, formal holiday rules my mother used to violently enforce. My foreman was currently attempting to carve a decorative squash into the shape of a monstera leaf, failing miserably, but providing excellent entertainment for the rest of the room. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the guests began to arrive. The heavy oak front doors, the exact doors I had been locked out of 12 months ago, while a blizzard raged around me, were thrown wide open. The crisp, cold air rushed in carrying the distinct scent of impending snow, but it was immediately chased away by the roaring, crackling fire burning in the entryway hearth. Meredith arrived first. My fierce, brilliant attorney had traded her usual sharp business suits for a cozy, oversized knit sweater and tall boots. She walked in carrying 3 incredibly expensive bottles of red wine and immediately pulled me into a massive, genuine hug. Mr. Thorne arrived shortly after her, accompanied by his wife. The meticulous independent auditor looked completely at ease, handing me a freshly baked cherry pie and marveling at the elaborate floral arrangements cascading from the ceiling beams. Soon the house was filled to the absolute brim. Over 40 people had RSVP'd to my Thanksgiving dinner. The guest list included my dedicated employees, my closest friends, the security guards who had helped me secure the premises, and the contractors who had worked tirelessly to rebuild the carriage house. It was a chaotic, brilliant mix of people from all walks of life. There was no strict dress code. There was no performative posturing to impress wealthy socialites. There was only genuine gratitude and shared warmth. As the afternoon shifted into a crisp, dark evening, I rang a small silver bell to call everyone into the formal dining room. The transformation of this specific space was my greatest personal triumph. The long, heavy mahogany table dominated the center of the room. It was the exact same piece of furniture where Patricia had casually slid a fraudulent eviction notice across the polished wood, telling me I had 2 hours to pack my entire life into garbage bags before I was thrown onto the street. Now that dark memory was completely eradicated by an overwhelming, beautiful feast. We had placed a massive, perfectly roasted turkey at the center, surrounded by dozens of heirloom ceramic bowls filled with garlic mashed potatoes, roasted root vegetables, candied yams, and fresh, crusty bread. Hundreds of warm white candles were scattered along the linen table runner, casting a flickering golden glow over the faces of my chosen family. I stood at the head of the table. This was the very spot Richard used to occupy when he delivered his pompous, self-serving speeches about the importance of bloodlines and financial dominance. I looked down the length of the table. 40 faces looked back at me, their eyes bright, their smiles completely authentic. The room grew naturally quiet. The clinking of silverware settled as Meredith smiled and raised her glass slightly, prompting the others to do the same. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the delicate stem of my wine glass. The deep crimson liquid caught the candlelight, glowing like a ruby. I took a slow, steady breath. I did not think about the neon orange safety vests on the side of the highway. I did not think about the frantic, desperate emails I had permanently deleted. I did not dedicate a single second of my mental energy to the people who had tried to destroy me. They were completely and permanently erased from my narrative. I raised my glass high into the air. To the people in this room, I began, my voice clear and ringing with absolute certainty. You are the true foundation of this home. You prove to me that family is not something you are simply born into. It is a structure you build from the ground up using respect, loyalty, and unwavering kindness. I looked up toward the massive stained glass window at the far end of the room, watching the interior light reflect off the colored glass. I also want to toast to the woman who built this estate. Grandma Josephine knew the true value of hard work, and she knew the incredible strength required to protect what matters. She left me a legacy, but more importantly, she left me the spine to defend it. I looked back down the table, meeting the eyes of the people who had stood by me when I had absolutely nothing. To independence, I said, my voice filled with a profound, unshakable joy. To the beautiful, messy, incredible journey of building your own life. And to the absolute certainty that no one can ever take it away from you. A chorus of cheerful voices echoed my words back to me. Glasses clinked together in a melodic, joyful wave of celebration. Laughter erupted, immediately warm and resonant, filling every corner of the grand room. I took a sip of the rich, expensive wine, letting the smooth, bold taste settle on my tongue. I sat down at the head of the table. I watched my friends passing plates of food, sharing stories, and creating brilliant new memories over the mahogany wood. The winter snow outside began to fall, painting the world in a quiet, pristine white, but the freezing cold could no longer touch me. The ghosts of the past were permanently banished. The war was officially over. I took another slow sip of wine, completely enveloped by the sweet, undeniable taste of a life perfectly and permanently earned. The most profound lesson from this narrative is that true self-worth is never defined by the family you are born into, but by the unwavering resilience you cultivate entirely within yourself. When toxic relatives use strict manipulation and harsh belittlement to maintain control, silently walking away isn't an act of failure. It is the ultimate declaration of independence. These stories teach us that personal success is the best silencer of doubt, and that chosen families built upon mutual respect often provide the unconditional love that biological ties simply cannot. Share your own experiences with setting healthy boundaries and comment below.